describe your mother in just a few words. For me, it's frankly an overachieving lawyer who likes organization a lot, as I've learned most mothers do. She was quite the workaholic. Growing up, my main impression of her was that she was this serious working woman. She would often come home late because of work, and on the days that she did come home early, it was both spent on her tutoring me on my homework. She would then carve out a part of her night to read the newspapers, which was something that she enjoyed. And she managed to maintain this hectic work schedule for the majority of my childhood, coming back home at around the same time, but eventually got too tired to maintain a conversation for more than 10 minutes and simply went straight to bed, not even reading the newspapers. As I grew up, I began to see something that had never occurred to me before. This congruity between my experience of having fun with friends and her doing the same in photos before. And with that, I'll give a bit of a background. When I look at the old photos of her having fun with her friends in university, first time moving away from her parents, and I see that they're different, not necessarily juxtaposed, but just different from photos of her pushing baby strollers around in the park and going to family gatherings with me and my sister at restaurants. To say that she looks different would be an apt descriptor, but incomplete. She looks different. She smiles in a different way. Before there was the joy of adolescence, adulthood. I see the glee in her eyes when she got the keys to her first apartment, and notably again, during her university graduation. While this seems to be muted down for photos later on, she still looks happy, but it's a different type of happiness, one of stability. There are no more emotional ups or downs, and her doing what seems like trivial tasks to most of us, which are not parents. As I grew up again, I begin to see this congruity between my experience of having fun with my friends and I look at the photos of my mother doing the same before. This led me to wonder whether I would lose this as I grow up and gain some form of parenting role. I remember that she used to look at me as if I was very precious, which I believe most mothers would think of us that way, looking at us almost in awe. Now that I've grown up, I wonder whether she looked at me as if she did a give and take, that in the process of achieving this image of domestic bliss, it was at the expense of something an 8-year-old was simply not aware of. I believe that most people in this room would recall the feeling of going to an amusement park. At the end of the day, your heart sinks a bit as the dopamine wears off and you fall asleep on the couch and back. But the sense of slight emptiness and yearning as you return, yet feeling calmness and tranquility that you haven't felt for so long. I guess this is a metaphor for what I think my mother had experienced, and I'm fully aware of the irony of this, as I'm nowhere near a parenting role whatsoever. But I think that the adults in this room would agree that this is a collective experience. In your 20s, the cynicism for what's possible hasn't yet set in, and the I know who I am, so I don't care of your 40s hasn't yet arrived. So in your 30s, you're stuck with this invisible, tacit deadline to get married, to have children, to love your job, feeling like you have to reach these adult milestones that become consequential as we age. You feel like, I should be married by now, I should have a job, I should love children by now. And evidently, there is the added biological pressure on women if they want to have biological children. My point is, with more responsibilities, it signifies that at the end of the day, you need to settle down. But I think that mothers experience this even more. Maybe I find it easier to understand her, or that I find it easier to sympathize with her. Perhaps there's some sort of collective female experience here, that because of women's primary role in childbearing, childbirth, and child-rearing, a life centered around the child from the point of conception to even after they're born. And I think that girls are sort of conditioned into this caretaking role. Getting gifted dolls and to take care of them at a young age is just a tiny example on the top of my head. Being attentive and caring is therefore considered feminine and inherently motherly qualities, which my mother, like many other mothers, is. Having a great sense of family obligation is one thing, and I don't want to paint a submissive picture of mothers or wives, but for my family at least, growing up my dad was often away, and even though my mother did address the compounded responsibilities and the burden that she might have felt, she was equally a person who adopted this resilient, suck-it-up mindset. Therefore, it was more like her succumbing to the particular circumstances in my family at that time. But generally, I think it's mothers who tend to give way more and take up more family chores and responsibilities as a result. This could be precisely why motherhood takes over you more. And this isn't unexpected of new motherhood, it being an all-consuming endeavor, which is why maternity leave exists, but this doesn't seem to stop even as I grew older. I remember she used to like going out during the weekends to eat breakfast and read the newspapers. It was just a part of who she was. Later on, her weekends were preoccupied with more work for children, parent-teacher conferences, and running errands for our family. Work and children, and juggling them simultaneously during the weekends. Eventually, her weekends were filled with these tasks. Oftentimes, she'd be too tired to pick up the newspapers, and they were simply laid neglected on the bedside table. From my childhood, she continues to assume this blended identity, more often known as Lydia's mother than by her own name. Not that there's anything necessarily wrong about this. As for her, and many other mothers that I know, I'm sure she wouldn't give up the life she had with her children, even if she could. But I do find her reminiscing about the times before she became a mother. I recall her playing 80s music at home, which seemed to really bring her back to her teenage years and in her 20s. Another example would be during our annual cleanup at Lunar New Year, she would nudge and pile the clothes that she wore in the 80s and 90s to the donation pile. But she would stare at them longingly, yet seems too embarrassed to look at them for too long in front of me and my sister. I was not, and am still not, entirely sure whether gaining the identity as a mother was more of this positive transition for her, or that there might be some remains of unfulfilled potential for her once. And I imagine that she would pick up her hobbies again as she gets older and retires, being less occupied with children. Would this be a way for her to reconcile and regain her past identities when she was younger? But again, on a happier note, what she loved was stability and balance, which seemed to align the whole family and children idea. And now that I've recently talked to her, it seemed to be something she was happy to look back on after all. I would like to look at my mother and the other mothers that I know through a different lens today. I would like to picture our mothers in the little girl forms. Imagine us all being held by our mothers as 12-year-olds, laughing with us and our friends, learning new things and just beginning to discover who we are. And I've come to the realization that we are all still just curious little girls on the inside. This is how we understand my own femininity and what being a mother means. Perhaps liking children in itself is not a reason justified enough to be a mother, when in the process of being one, you seem to assume this whole new identity. Some might see becoming a mother as a rebirth, a regeneration of a new purpose, while others might see it as the ultimate roller coaster of comfort and fear, love and frustration. But it is a frightening change nonetheless. For the parents here today, and my mother, it is to have your daughter, your children grow up and understand herself like you once did with yourself before. It is to learn from each other. You might be the parent now, but this clear-cut dynamic might fade away with time. And if you're lucky enough, one day, your children might just grow to understand you as a person, outside of your label as a parent. For me, it's almost like I'm looking at her as she grows up, viewing her as the little girl, to a teenager, to a woman in her 20s, and so on, and to understand her as she grows and flourishes into an adult woman and into a mother, my mother for the matter. But to also remember that she as a person is so much more than who she is to me, and that she as a person cannot be encompassed by the singular identity of a mother. And it is only through this that I'm able to embrace her as a woman and as a person. Thank you.